press up the grits and get that edge even finer. So, as I mentioned, this is a Japanese waterstone, and it being a waterstone,
Tea kopi.
Okay.
hey, what's up, guys? Today I've got a sort of sharpening. So, started on my coarse stone. This whetstone has been soaked. With this
Okay.
type of stone, you don't have to tend to just float on the surface, and your stone doesn't get as clogged as easily. But obviously, you can sharpen it dry if you want. So, I'm just gonna find my bevel, and you can do usually just to take a permanent mark away.
Hmm.
You don't have to use one
Nah,
hand. Some people
aku
like to
bakal
put two hands. They feel more control. But if I'm usually when I'm using a small knife or sharpening a small knife, I will just use one hand. Usually after about 10 passes, you'll find that you'll start to develop a burr. That's usually when you can switch to the other side. You don't have to do it that way, but that's how I've done it. So I'm just going to keep going until I form that burr. I'm going to look at my edge. I'm not really hitting the full bevel yet, because I can see some of the red is still there. So
Okay.
I'm just going to keep going.
Coba coba cobain apain.
So guys, I've switched to the other side of the bevel now, and you'll notice I'm not lifting up the blade after each pass. I'm just letting it rest on the stone. So this is a different way of,
Iya,
it's
aku
just another way of
pikir.
doing it, and it helps in that you don't have to reset your bevel every time you
Ah,
lift the
ah,
knife off the stone.
oke. Mulai
So
tajam nih.
after doing one pass, rather than lifting the knife off the stone, I'm just gonna rest it on the stone.
Ini katanya
I'm not really pressing down hard. And then I'm just gonna bring it back like that, the entire bevel. Alright guys, I switched the angle of the stone just because it was kind of awkward to work around the camera. And I just realized I didn't show the initial sharpness test, but trust me, this knife was as dull as a butter knife because I had just stone washed the blade and it was, yeah, zero cutting performance. So, another tip I want to give you guys is if you look at the bevel of your blade and you notice that one area isn't getting hit as much, I mean, you can feel free to just, focus on that one area by doing something like this. As long as you keep that bevel consistent, that's all that really matters. But usually after I do something like that, I'll just give it one last like that, just to keep everything as consistent as possible. So at this
minimal
point, I
hampir
feel as
10.
if I'm pretty much there. I can see the scratch pattern is really uniform on the bevel.
ก็สปู
So how do you know when to move on to the next grit? Well, it's pretty easy. General rule of thumb is get the knife as sharp as possible with
โอเค
this.
สร้างเงินอะไรอ่ะ
So at this point, I feel as if I'm pretty much there. I can see the scratch pattern is really uniform on the bevel. So how do you know when to move on to the next grit? Well, it's pretty easy. General rule of thumb is get the knife as sharp as possible with this grit before moving on. Okay guys, I'm moving on to my medium grit, and as you can see, I've got pretty much there. I can see the scratch pattern is really uniform on the bevel. So how do you know when to move on to the next grit? Well, it's pretty easy. General rule of thumb is get the knife as sharp as possible with this grit before moving on. Okay guys, I'm moving on to my medium grit, and as you can see, I've gotten it pretty decently sharp with the coarse stone. So another tip for just checking the sharpness is just by taking the weight, just the weight of the blade, sort of resting it on your
ภาษาอังกฤ
fingernail.
ษเรานี่
And if it catches, you can tell that you've got a pretty good edge
ต้อง
on
บอก
there. And check, like, all edges of the blade, just run it along. And if you want to figure out if you have any sort of dings or nicks in your blade, just run your fingernail up the cutting edge carefully, of course, and you'll be able to tell if you have any dings or chips in your blade. Obviously, at this point, I don't because of the use of the coarse side. So with the medium grain, I'm just gonna, or medium grit rather, I'm just gonna do the same thing. Find my bevel, do a bunch of passes till I get a burr, switch the other side, get it as sharp as possible.
มัน
As possible. I'm just gonna pretty feel as if, and as you can see, I've gotten it pretty decently sharp with the sort of sections up the coarse side. So
So
how do you know when to move on to the next grit? Well, it's pretty easy. General rule of thumb is get the knife as sharp as possible with this grit before moving on. The sharp sort of rests good edge on there. Run it next in your blade, just obviously a grain. Alright guys, I mean, it's going to get your knife here. It must be you'll know waterstone. The bevel, your path, the jet waterstone,
ไม่ทราบbegitu.
one side of the bevel
Sama gimana ya?
side was about the 1000 grit.
Ganti wajahnya. Awas. Kamu disusuk.
Alright guys, I just finished with the
Okay.
red side of the water stone, and that side was about the 1000 grit.
Panas tenang.
So this side here is about 4000 grit. So at this point the knife is starting to get very sharp. You won't be able to push cut at this point, but it still slices through paper very easily. Subtle, right? Same finishing 1000 grit side. Right, so I'm just finishing up a few more light passes on the
8 kali. Tidak. Empat. Okay.
The knife is now the same thing, it's just a lot when you touched it.